Good afternoon, Jeff. How are
Good,
you?
how are you?
Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much for coming by and joining Canadians with Disabilities and their allies
Well,
today.
thanks for the invite.
Yeah, so I just wanted to introduce you to everybody. Jeff is actually joining us today, everybody, and Jeff's actually from the York region in Ontario. He's a lawyer, executive director of Community Legal Clinic, and today we'll be talking about the CDB and long-standing issues of income inequality, and possibly we'll talk about if you have knowledge about the CRPD, the rights on Canadians with disabilities that was enacted into 12 years ago, but so far nothing's really come out of it. So yeah, I'll let you take over from there, and then if anyone has any questions after, they can we can do a discussion group.
Sure. Yeah, well, as you say, I run the legal clinic in York region, north of Toronto, and been a legal clinic lawyer since 1990, so that's sort of how far back I go as far as dealing with disability issues. And I'm sort of conscious that, and I had said this semi-jokingly to a friend who was retiring not too long ago, that since she got involved around the same time that I did, it's been pretty much all downhill. That our efforts have not seen us go in a positive direction. And I was thinking back about some of the things that have changed and how generally things are I think, much harder for disabled Canadians now than they were at that time. And I'm conscious, for example, that when I started, there was lots of rent geared to income housing, that the expectation was that if you were a disabled person, that you would have an apartment to live in, and in most cases, one that was pretty new, actually. There was lots being built. And in those days, they were funded by the federal government, of course, who got out of that business largely under Prime Minister Chrétien, who downloaded the housing to the provinces. In Ontario, the Premier, Mike Harris, promptly downloaded it to municipalities who have always said they don't have a tax base for really funding deeply affordable housing. There's a kind of insidious term that has arisen, affordable housing, that you hear all the time from government. They're announcing affordable housing. But in Ontario, at least, affordable housing is not affordable for most people who are on disability benefits. It costs too much, being based on 30% of the average market rent, and market rents, of course, have gone crazy. I'm conscious that back when I started as a legal clinic lawyer, that there were very few appeals from people who had applied for disability benefits at that time. And I think the reason was that the government at that time was using doctors to make the assessments as to whether somebody was disabled or not. And in 1997, again, Premier Harris decided he could save some money by getting rid of the doctors and replacing them with non-doctors to do the assessments, something called the Disability Adjudication Unit. And they are not as good as doctors at determining whether somebody is medically disabled. And so appeals went through the roof and have been through the roof ever since. That I think most people who apply for Ontario disability benefits these days can expect to be turned down the first time. They're generally going to have to go through an appeal to the Social Benefits Tribunal, where usually they'll be granted, but they've just put this extra roadblock, substantial roadblock in place that delays getting benefits by a couple of years for people who are disabled. I'm conscious that disability benefits have fallen way below inflation. And it seems like governments have just decided, they've just sort of given up on the idea that benefits should provide a living amount of income, so that you could live a life with some security and some dignity. And they seem to be just deciding that where they're going to fall behind, they're comfortable to fall behind when it comes to keeping up with inflation for disability benefits. It's funny because many of your listeners probably have no idea who Mike Harris is. It was a long time ago, but he still sort of haunts us to this day because he cut a lot of programs that were never restored, and he made it okay to freeze disability benefits. And I'm reminded that apparently the last premier in Ontario, progressive conservative premier, who voluntarily raised disability benefit rates was Premier Bill Davis in the 1970s. And the progressive conservatives have had a strong and to date intact policy of never increasing disability benefits at all. that if there's going to be increases, they come when the Liberals are in government. And the Liberals don't catch up. At most, they sort of keep pace with inflation. But tracking the bigger picture, we fall behind. And of course, the quality of life for disabled people has fallen significantly. And I think about now, of course, with rents having gone through the roof and most people not being able to get into rent geared to income housing, which they're not building much of anymore. You just can't rent an apartment anymore. That in our region, the average rent for a one-bedroom apartment is about $1,600 a month, and the shelter allowance that you're allowed as a single disabled person is $497 a month. So the total benefit that you get is about $1,100. So there's just no way that you can expect to rent an apartment and live independently. A lot of people now are renting individual rooms. People are going to shelters for want of any other alternative. If they rent rooms, in most cases they lose the protections of the Residential Tenancies Act, like security of tenure, so they can be evicted at any time on a moment's notice, basically. A lot of the circumstances, of course, are very unhealthy for disabled people. The ones that I know, and I've done a lot of disability appeals over the years, most of those folks are not well, and they're supposed to be working on their wellness by trying to avoid stress and trying to, in many cases, that means they need a quiet space. And if they're renting a room from somebody, usually with some other people who are renting rooms, they're not going to get that. And again, they know that at any moment, if their landlord decides they didn't look at them the right way, they can just throw them out on the street. And it seems like governments are more or less okay with that nowadays. Even Liberal governments, federally, we hear a lot about good things that they're going to do, but they act very slowly. And I'm kind of reminded of the old saying that Liberals campaign from the left but govern from the right. And I'm conscious right now that with, for example, the Canada Disability Benefit, that the government is moving quite slowly on it. And when you're a minority government, realistically, you could fall at any time. And to bring in such a large program would take all the time they've got. And if they were serious about it, they'd be moving as fast as they can. But they seem to be dragging their feet on it. And it's quite possible, if not probable, that people are going to get tired of Justin Trudeau at some point and decide to give this Pierre Poilievre a shot. And everything I've ever heard about him is that he's a nasty, nasty guy. That's kind of how he made his reputation in the House of Commons. And so I can't imagine that he's going to do anything good for disabled people, that I expect that he would see this as another potential source to cut benefits and reduce taxes in the traditional kind of hard right conservative mold. When I think about the provincial government really doesn't want to talk about the disabled. They had a budget last week where the word disability was never mentioned once. The only thing that the minister, Dr. Fullerton, ever says when asked about, how are people supposed to be affording rent these days, is, well, we're hoping that the Canada Disability Benefit will come in soon. And of course, it's totally just disingenuous, because the constitutional responsibility for providing disability benefits rests with the province. The province does provide benefits. They can't just say, oh, well, somebody else said they might look after the problem someday, so we're not doing anything. But that is what their approach has been, up till now at least. We've had the Green Party have announced that if they were elected, they would double ODSP rates, which is about what it would need to make it affordable so you could pay rent. The NDP, somewhat disappointingly, said that they would increase ODSP by 20%. And it's one of those things, it's kind of like building half of a bridge, that unless you go the whole way, it's not going to be that useful. So unless they're increasing ODSP sufficiently that people can actually afford rent in the current market, I guess something is better than nothing, but it's not enough that people are actually going to be able to get back to the independent living that they traditionally had in apartments. That's, as I say, kind of disappointing that they took that position. The other thing that the province is focused on when it comes to disability benefits is fondly held conservative saying that the best social program is a job. So they've been putting a lot of energy into developing a program to hire a private contractor to encourage people on benefits to get jobs. And what's perverse about that is that in every disability benefit appeal that I ever did, although the standard in Ontario is supposed to be that you qualify for Ontario Disability Support Program benefits if you're expected to be unable to do any type of work for at least a year, the reality in those appeals is that you have to prove that you're never going back to work. If there's any prospect that you're going to get back to work at some point in the future, you will lose. So the folks who are on benefits have already had to prove that they can't work, they're not getting back to work, and yet the government's response is, well, we're going to hire a private contractor to get you back to work. And it's like, well, if you talk to their doctor, they would say that's going to fail. That's just not going anywhere. But again, that's where the progressive conservative government has directed their energy, and they have this perfect record of never increasing disability benefits that I guess they want to stick to. What's kind of hard for me to understand is that I get that if you're a conservative, you don't like people who are on welfare because your perspective is that they're lazy and that's why they can't support themselves. But it seems to me that it's accepted that, again, if a doctor has said you cannot do any type of work, it's not your fault that you can't get an income. And I think, every family has some relative who's disabled, has friends who are disabled, including conservative families. And I think, conservative politicians all have family members or friends who are disabled, and they can see how hard their lives are with the little bit of support that they're getting. And I don't understand why they have no sympathy, evidently, for them. I don't understand that at all. But again, they seem to have this determination that they're not going to help and that they're going to leave it to the Liberals to help when they get back into government. The Liberals will help somewhat, and then when the Conservatives get back in, they will just freeze disabled people out as long as they can. So that's kind of a little thumbnail of where I come from on this stuff, having watched the scene for a little over 30 years, I guess. It is certainly very meaningful for me because I have a close family member who's disabled, living on CPPD and ODSP. And again, I see how hard things are. And fortunately, in that family member's case, we're able to help out a little bit, and some other relatives were able to help out a bit. But again, I just don't understand how we've gotten to the point where we once agreed as a society that if you were disabled, you should have the right to live independently with some dignity and with some security. And now we just seem to have abandoned that.
Absolutely, and very, very well spoken, Jeff, on these topics. Very important topics that need to be echoed, across the whole nation. Because in my view is that, and it's a fact too, in many cases that anyone can become disabled at any point in time in their life. I mean, either they're born with it, they've developed different disabilities as time goes on. As they age, the population ages, they're going to get some kind of disability, and knock on wood, if they don't, well, I mean, they don't, but the stats show that they will, in some cases, get a disability, and it's no fault of their own, and they shouldn't not be punished by policymakers who feel that, you've got a disability. Well, a job is the solution to all, to everything. Well, there are people who are working, and that's great if they can. But in many cases, there's so many different types of disabilities that are out there that limits down what they can do into contribute into society. But a job is not the solution. Is that some people can't work?
Yeah, and I don't know whether history will record sort of the period from the 60s to the 80s as the high watermark for support for disabled friends and family. I hope not. But again, there's just this sliver of society that happen to be running things right now who just do not believe in that and have this perfect record of never increasing disability benefits since the 70s. It's a mystery.